Since it's February and we like to spread the love, I wore my Valentine's Day sweater. Also, if you're interested in enrolling your child in our services before February 28th, we are offering a special discount for Valentine's Day. So let's move on. Today, we are grateful to have Jonah Green here for a discussion on the thoughtful divorce, fostering resilience and growth through stress and transition. Sure, a lot of people know friends that have gone through a divorce or are currently going through a divorce or have gone through a divorce. And Jonah's really here to explain how to do that without putting the kids in the middle, for sure. So separation and divorce are among the most challenging transitions a family can face. While parents strive to create stability, knowing the best ways to support children through these changes is not always easy. Today's conversation is about helping children navigate divorce with confidence and security while they're fostering resilience and maintaining emotional well-being. To guide us, we are honored to welcome Jonah Green, who is a licensed social worker, and he will go through with you a little bit about his background. He's highly experienced working with children, adolescents, and families for over 30 years, navigate divorce, co-parenting, and family transitions. I didn't add this, Jonah, but you might want to let them know if you actually do court work too. Jonah is widely respected for his compassionate, family-centered approach and has been recognized as a top therapist by Washingtonian Magazine and a favorite therapist by Washington Parent Magazine readers. He specializes in supporting families through major life changes, helping parents minimize conflict, and ensuring children feel safe and supported during all these hard transitions. So we are here today to welcome Jonah, and he will provide us with practical and research-backed strategies to help you guys create a healthy co-parenting dynamic, talk to children about divorce in an age-appropriate way, and manage emotional challenges during this transition. He will also offer us insights on custody schedules, minimizing conflict, and supporting children with learning differences or emotional sensitivities. Jonah, we are so excited to have you here. Thank you for joining us. Why don't you go ahead and share your screen and you can get started, and I will keep track of the questions in the chat. And if you see something and you want to answer, that's great. If you don't want to answer it, it'll interrupt what you're doing. We'll answer those at the end.
Okay, sharing my screen. Hold on a second.
No problem.
Let me. Okay, am I sharing my?
Yep.
I have to get to the slideshow, right?
Yep. Just click slideshow there. You'll be all set.
Okay.
There you go.
All right. So I'm really honored Wendy and Lindsay contacted me and asked me to do this. And this is on separating and divorcing in a way that works best for the whole family, including the kids, but also you and your co-parent. And I'm going to go on to the next slide. Whoops. This should be, here we are. Okay. So a little bit about me. This is the first. So I'm a child, adolescent, and family therapist. I've been doing this about 30 years. I was actually, they reminded me, I guess I gave my resume, that I was a special education teacher before being a therapist. I do have a practice of about 15 therapists that provides child and family therapy, as well as therapy for adults as well. And we do work with a lot of kids with learning differences. I've worked with divorcing families, divorced families, and step families pretty much all through my career. And all of us work from what we would call in the field a family systems perspective. So we will be integrating family work along with child work, tween, teen work. Family therapy is really my specialization, and helping families through transitions, including separation and divorce. I do lead trainings for therapists in family therapy, including in something called divorce therapy, helping families navigate separation and divorce. And I have some other training programs for therapists. There's a lot of us here with different kinds of specializations. that work with very young children, even as young as 3, all the way up to teens and young adults, and with all different uh, neurodivergence, LGBTQIA+, all different types of diversity and areas of specialization. Um, let's go to the next slide. So this is about you. I guess this is, I'd ask you maybe to think about this for the, if you feel comfortable sharing, um, this could be part of the discussion once we get through this presentation, which will be kind of 35, 40 minutes. And I hope to have plenty of time for a fruitful discussion. We all have kind of senses of what divorce is. These are some thoughts maybe to think about. This is all voluntary in terms of any sharing, but it might be helpful. Your early life experience with divorce, um, your experience as an adult with a divorce. Everyone in our society has been touched in some way by divorce, whether it's extended family or people we know, whether it's in our own childhood, and your sense of what you think constitutes a good divorce, or if there is such a thing, or a divorce that works best for the whole family. What I would say is, and I'll speak about this in the next slide, as a society, I think we have come a long way in terms of thinking about what tends to work best, and there are now some guidelines for people, and as well as supports for people. And what do you think are steps that, as a parent, one might take if one is contemplating separation or divorce? What are the barriers also to better divorces? And that could include needs of children, needs of extended family, characteristics of separating and divorcing couples. And you can put your questions or comments or thoughts about yourself, if you feel comfortable, in the chat, and we'll talk about it when we get to the end of the presentation. So let's see. So can't see the whole thing. So all right, so separation and divorce, as many people know, have affected millions of families. So you go back to the 40s and the 50s, it's like a 5% divorce rate. It was really kind of building in the 60s, and by the mid 70s, that's when the divorce rate really shot up. Kind of 1975 was the big year. And at that point, divorce rates shot up for first marriage families over 50%, and they've since fallen back somewhat closer to 40% and kind of stabilized to that. When I say first marriage families, I mean not a step family, but step families divorce too, and that's where you get, and they have higher rates of divorce, and that's where you get into the 50% range for divorce, or closer to it. It's still below, it's below 50%. And in kind of a brief kind of sociological history, a lot of people know this. It used to be, when there was divorce, generally speaking, the kids stayed with the mom, and the dad, at least was supposed to support the family financially. And then there kind of developed customary, kind of every other weekend, Wednesday nights type of thing for dads. And then they were still supporting the family. What happened in the 70s, or at least we're supposed to be supporting the family. What happened in the 70s was something called father's rights, and a lot of men started to dispute that, and then you start to get tying in of custody and child support, so money and custody, and this idea of kids going to different homes, and that's tied to how much money is sent out. And then very quickly you got the phenomenon of high conflict divorce, which we're going to talk about, which we realized did a tremendous number on kids, and on adults and on the family. And we realized that the way that families separated and divorced had an outsized impact on the family as a whole, as a divorced family, for years and years to come, and had a tremendous impact on the kids in particular, but also the adults. So now there is now some best practices that have developed. There's clinicians out there, there's coaches, parent coaches, there's attorneys, there's other third parties, there's mediators, And people as a society as a whole, we've really realized the value of an intentional separation and divorce. And just as an example, until the 80s, there was no word for co-parenting. And now that's very much in the lexicon. And we know something about how important that is. We're going to be talking about this idea of co-parenting. And in this presentation, we're going to be talking about practical ideas to manage the separation and divorce process. So here's some thoughts. If you're with your spouse or married or unmarried, with another parent, you're trying to work through the relationship, and separation is a possibility. There are alternatives to a permanent separation and divorce, of course. And couples therapy is one thing. It's not the only thing. There's also, of course, couples weekends. There's coaches. There's all different kinds of. There's faith counseling. There are different divorce, even intentional divorces that are done very well, can be very difficult on families. There's something called living apart together, which is actually that's more kind of for step families. It's really kind of living together apart. Actually, would be more of that next category. And people do try it, and sometimes that does work, at least for a certain period of time, where the parents are kind of in separate rooms and living somewhat separate lives, but living in the same house. And sometimes that, obviously there's problematic, or it can be difficult, it can be challenging, but sometimes this can be the best arrangement for a period of time. There's also kind of temporary separations that people try. What I would say is, in terms of a guideline, if you're looking at separation and divorce, there's two things which are somewhat contrasting. It is important to be deliberate. This is a huge decision for the family. It's also important to be relatively expeditious. So, as I said, the way that families separate and divorce has a tremendous impact on the family as a whole. When I say the family as a whole, not only the children, everybody. We're going to talk about the importance of supporting yourself and the other adults who are the co-parents. So it's important also to be expeditious, in the sense like a back and forth. Too many tries in different arrangements can actually be very difficult on kids, and we'll talk about it. The kids will talk about it years later in therapy office. I have personal experience with that. So if you're moving towards separation, it's important to kind of balance those two things, being both expeditious and deliberate, and to be intentional about it, to sort out the details of the actual separation, how the person who's going to leave the house is going to actually leave, and sort it out beforehand. We'll talk about that in a minute, and set up a preliminary parenting plan, which is I like to call it's intentionally called a parenting plan and not custody. It's kind of how you're going to parent together during this transitional time, which could include where the kids stay. Using, broadly speaking, in terms of what's best for the family, and this could be seen as very controversial, looking from a legal perspective, and money is in the mix. Something called the approximation rule, which is, I think, if you remember anything in terms of what's best for kids, that this is a huge change. Even the best of separations and divorces, and in some ways, sometimes all things being equal, even though it's a loss of the nuclear family, it could be, in a sense, a stressor, but a better life for the kids and the family. It's really essential, as much as possible, that the kids' lives stay as much the same as is practicable, as is feasible. So, in other words, if possible, same schools, same soccer teams, same activities, access to the same friends. And again, how families separate and divorce is going to set up how the family will function, and it will have an outsized impact on your kids and ultimately on generations to come. Telling the children, ideally, together in a planful way, clear and age appropriate, or I should say developmentally appropriate, Um, Sometimes, like for very young children, there's the brown house, there's the blue house. You're going to be staying here, you're going to be staying there. Mommy, you can still speak to mommy on the phone. So tell them where they're going to live. Um, in a developmentally appropriate way. They need to know about what will affect them, their friends, their activities, how much they will see parents, they will see parents, how their routines will be affected. Again, those are the things that they need to know. And I would say, in general, once you know there's going to be a separation, it is important that you tell them because often, depending on the developmental age, depending on their intuitiveness, they may know anyway, and it becomes a pretty important secret that you're keeping from them. So, and help them anticipate future changes as well, at least slowly, maybe not in that first conversation, but what might be the next move, what might be the next school. Um, in terms of the talk with the kids, I think many of us know now, and we didn't know in the 1970s or the 80s in many ways, that it's important that the kids know that it's not their fault, that there was a separation, and it's also not either one of the parents' fault. There's a couple of things that parents sometimes miss. Kids really benefit when they know that the parents tried, that they really tried to keep the marriage together, because it is a loss. Even if it was a very difficult marriage and the kids saw a lot of fighting, it's a loss of a nuclear family, and that the marriage itself was intentional and based on love, and that, that was important to both of you. To the extent that one can, with integrity, say that to the kids, that can be very, very helpful. It's important for kids to know that their feelings, all the feelings that they have, are okay. That you'll listen to their feelings as feelings, um, and also that it's also important to respect the authority of each parent who's going to be in charge at their own home. So, setting up from the very beginning this idea that you're supportive the um, of the other parent in terms of their relationship and also their authority. One thing that parents, oftentimes really thoughtful and kind parents, one pitfall is they will naturally feel guilty and they'll naturally let up on limit setting. And kids who are separating and divorcing really need limits. They have already experienced a situation where the kind of healthy hierarchy is fractured. They need loving firmness. They need a healthy hierarchy, and they need co-parenting, which we're going to talk about. And that it's important that the kids know that, of course, it's not their fault, but they will have roles and responsibilities, and there may be different kinds of roles and responsibilities. For instance, for older children, that's a natural role. Um, in a way, parents kind of bristle at that sometimes. This idea that an oldest child might be doing more of the babysitting, and it's kind of taking away from their childhood. That is, it's important to talk about that. It's important to balance that with their own needs for development. It's also how families tend to work best when there's sometimes a more developmentally older child who might be kind of deputized. Um, and that you're still a family. You're a different kind of a family, but so a phrase that often uses you're a two-home family, and that the parents are going to be working together. To the extent that you can say that, that can be very, very helpful. Typically developing, so this is for typically developing children's reactions and needs. And I know that not all children are typically developing. Um, and we're going to have a slide on that too. So the preschool years, the early elementary school years, oftentimes kids can be very confused. They can get very scared. They can regress um, in terms of some of their behaviors, tantrums and anger, difficulty sleeping, blaming themselves. And it's important to keep all that in mind. They need a lot of love. They need a lot of encouragement. They need a lot of confidence building. They need a lot of structure. Um, Middle elementary years, oftentimes there's a lot of sadness. They might tend to withdraw, might develop academic problems, a lot of anger, beginning of some acting out. And what they'll begin to develop as they become more aware of the different problems in the family, is loyalty conflicts and not knowing that it's okay to love who they want to love, and also make it's hard for them to differentiate between respect, which for kids ought to be unconditional, as opposed to feelings of closeness, which are their own feelings. And their needs is that they need an assurance that they can love who they wish they love. They need a validation of their own feelings. They need a lot of encouragement. There is a tendency towards sadness and some depression in those years when there's separation, divorce. And as I said before, they need responsibilities. They need whatever you do in the family in terms of chores or roles, and they need limits as well. Teens are definitely at risk of a lot of risky behaviors and acting out, difficulties with relationships, a lot of anger as well as depression. They, of course, need encouragement and support. They also need responsibilities. They definitely need limits, and this is where some of the co-parenting comes in again, and they need to be given appropriate choices for them, and there'll be plenty of time for discussion as we move through. Children with emotional sensitivities and learning differences might be less able to verbalize their feelings. So it's important to kind of use alternate forms, drawing, or different ways of them expressing themselves, modes of expression. They might need more reassurance and more structure. They certainly will need more increased coordination between co-parents and the importance of the approximation rule. And there's an increased need for generally speaking, less transitions and also contact with the other parent. We're going to talk about that in a minute in terms of scheduling, and they may need increased support. And so that may include therapy, individual therapy, relationship therapy of some sort, family therapy, sibling therapy, um, school accommodations, of course, and all types of supports, including tutoring services and academic support services. And they need more regularity. Broadly speaking, everything is individual here, but there is more of a need for consistency between households. So in terms of custody scheduling, again, this is outside of the okay. So the kind of old school is the very old school would be kids stay with their mom and they have one home. That's not necessarily, I mean, and now that's kind of passe in a lot of for me, and what I'll say here at the bottom is the important thing is that kids have a relationship and a connection to both parents. Custody is really in partly for us. Um, there can be many arrangements where parents don't live with kids, where kids parents don't live with kids at all, but they see their kids, throughout each day. Um, Proximity definitely helps, but generally speaking, if you're going to have custody, more frequent transitions are more appropriate for younger children to increase contact with the parents. And for toddlers, these kind of 2255s, 2525s, different. And then sometimes there is a primary residence, and then sometimes you might stay over 1 or 2 nights a week, plus other times together. You're balancing access with the disruptive impact of transitions. School age, when you have joint physical custody, you start getting into what's best for kids. These are broadly speaking what's best, but this has got to be kind of viewing what's best, conversation. By school age, your parents are making the decisions, but kids are having a say, alternating weeks or split weeks, perhaps. And if a primary residence, sometimes there's that idea that I spoke about in the beginning of weekends and then a midweek visit. Generally speaking, kids have more choice or ought to have more choice as they get older. And sometimes they might spend 1 week on, 1 week off, or they might have a primary residence. Again, the important thing is that they have a relationship and a connection to each parent rather than this idea of custody, which is more for us, which doesn't mean that's not what we do, because it is in many ways what we do. Okay, the legal process, really important to manage the legal process. How families divorce sets up family communication pattern for years to come. Lawyers, family lawyers are experts on the law, and they're experts on protecting you. They're not experts on child development. They're certainly not experts on family communication. They're not even experts. They're not trained on negotiation when you have to negotiate with a co-parent and keep the relationship together. So you use them ideally as experts on the law and use that information and definitely watch for using the legal process as a means of getting justice. If you have experience being wronged in the marriage, there's different options. We're not going to go through all this. There's certainly mediation. Collaborative law is something where when it looks like it's going to be a high conflict divorce, and a lot of professionals can get involved, can be helpful. It is less expensive than a high conflict divorce, which can be extraordinarily expensive. And a lot of people do it yourself divorce, um, when it's very amicable and it's relatively simple. But most common is some form of attorney involvement, sending emails back and forth. Um, Most problematic is when you start getting into litigation, and that's something that ultimately can't be controlled, because your action is going to lead to a reaction. And I'm not saying it's never appropriate, especially when there's power imbalances, um, but it can be very treacherous. So some pitfalls for parents: they get stuck in their anger, they get stuck in their grief, they also get stuck in elation, and they abdicate responsibilities, not allowing for appropriate grief for themselves or for their children. Inconsistent discipline, I refer to that, a focus on revenge or justice, especially through legal avenues, as I mentioned, not prioritizing the co-parenting relationship, which we're going to get to, a lack of a clear vision for the two-home family, and pardon me, not managing third parties effectively, including in-laws. A lot of in-laws may not have a sense of the importance of the co-parenting relationship and may be very focused on justice. And you're going to need to protect that co-parenting relationship as best as possible. Signs of a high conflict divorce. So divorce, as I said, can be very difficult on children. It can also be the best thing for the family. It could also be a growth experience. It could be a way in which they can learn to negotiate different transitions and um, and grow and learn. High conflict divorce is pretty much never healthy for children and ultimately for adults and even for the next generation. So these are some signs. Um, CPS reports. Again, that doesn't mean there's not, sometimes doesn't have to be CPS reports. This is a sign of a high conflict divorce. Child Protective Services reports, restraining orders or stay away orders, both parents staying in the home in order to protect assets, hiding assets and income, toxic involvement of third parties, including lawyers or in-laws, no priority to the well-being of the co-parent. It often becomes kind of what I see in my practice is an accusation: you're not taking the best interest of the kids into heart. Well, the truth is that the parents, all, it's also important as a co-parent to take the interests of the co-parent into heart, because they need to feel supported. Motions of contempt in courts, litigated custody, the effect on children and families, unfortunately, is very severe. The co-parenting relationship, we're going to spend a few slides on this. It's crucial for family well-being. The way I'm defining it is really it's co-parenting. It's not a friendship. It's not a spousal relationship. Ideally, it's friendly. It's like a business partner relationship, ideally, but your partner's in the family business and you can't get out of the family business. So it's somewhat more distant and formal. You're providing a certain amount of support, but you're not using the other parent to work out your feelings with in the same way. When there's difficulty with parenting, there are different models. Cooperative co-parenting is ideal if it's more amicable. Sometimes you need to set up something called parallel parenting. Excuse me. And by that time, I think it is important to have professionals in the mix to help you set up kind of means of communication, and topics of communication, emails, texts, etc. Very important to attend to the tone, probably more than anything. And remember, in text and email, we can't read tone, and sending angry texts and emails in the middle of the night can be very treacherous. And sometimes it can be very beneficial if you to use co-parenting therapists and other professionals to work on the communication. Um, so children and co-parenting. Very important when you're working with your co-parent to keep the kids out of the middle, to not blame the other parent for the divorce, watching things like tone, body language, choice of words when talking about the other parent. So actually, no, trash talking the other parent is not actually very effective for parental alienation. It'll often come back on the parent. I mean, these are kind of very sad choice of words that I'm using right now, because effective is not a great word. But it actually usually doesn't alienate them. You'll end up alienating yourself when you trash talk. But what's tragically very effective is kind of like, oh, dad, that kind of thing. And body language, tone, looking at them as not important or hopeless. Um, Very important that we show some form of confidence in the competence and the relevance of the other parent. Certainly avoid discussing adult issues with the children, such as infidelity or finances. Manage messages from third parties. Don't use children as messengers. And watch for something which we see in family therapy, particularly with divorcing families, cross generational coalitions. In other words, like dad and daughter versus mom and son, and that kind of alliances. Very important that it's a very protective relationship, sibling relationships during divorce, to the extent that that can be nurtured. Oftentimes, when I'm doing separation and divorce therapy with families, I'm focusing in on working with the siblings and getting them to support each other. More focus on the co-parenting relationship. The primary focus of communication is going to be the well-being of the children, but also at the same time, the co-parent is part of this. It's important that the co-parent be strong, that they be seen as a authority, and that in their home, both in terms of nurturance and in terms of limits. Certainly watch for accusations, sweeping characterizations. Might have had this in the marriage. This idea of gathering evidence. Well, everybody sees, don't you see? They said. Even the co-parent therapist thinks. Um, Keep a present focus as much as possible. Take into consideration their needs, and practice reflection, which many people may have heard of, therapists use all the time, where they kind of summarize or paraphrase what the other person says, or and take into account power differentials of money. There's also emotional power differentials in terms of who has the affection of the kids, and generally speaking, the person who leaves has more emotional power than the person who's left. And oftentimes there is more of a leaver and a left, than not. Sometimes it's more mutual, but oftentimes it is not. Um, More about communication. Setting boundaries is about what you're going to do, not about demanding what the other person is going to do. That's more of a request. I request that you call me during the evening, uh, before 9 p.m., not after. Um, and whereas what your a boundary is that you don't pick up after 9 p.m., but you're not telling them what to do. The idea of I statements, many people have heard that. I feel, um, I want, I notice, I think. I feel criticized is not an I statement. That's a description of the other person. So it is important to kind of really look, interrogate yourself in terms of the way you're using that language. The value of acknowledgments, the way I define acknowledgments is like, I'm not all right. Either I'm not all right, you're not all wrong, or at least I can see your point. And to the extent that you can do that, that can really take you down from the that plane of who's right and who's wrong and who's good and who's bad, and you can get to collaboration. Watch for something called apology demands, which demanding an apology either in your head or verbally. That becomes a power struggle, which nobody really wins. I mentioned active listening, avoiding overreaction in the moment. This is not a time to kind of use to fight in the way that you did when you were partnered. And to the extent possible, show confidence in them and their relationship with the children. Um, Working together in the two homes, balance the benefits of consistency in rules, discipline, and schedules with respect for two different homes, two parents, two homes, who can have different bedtimes. As I said, all these things need to be balanced to the extent that there's special needs. Um, excuse me, there needs to be more coordination and more ideally consistency and similarity. Joint decisions about essential issues as much as possible, medical and educational, and balance the benefit of taking into account each other's perspective, the other people's perspective, the other co-parents' perspective with the well-being of children. So you're not only speaking for the well-being of the children, you're also hearing about the perspective of the other parent and their needs. So that's an important takeaway. Um, so in terms of helping the kids prepare for transitions, transitions are often difficult. Um, it's important to balance the amount of transitions versus the need for contact, prepare kids in advance, minimize the need for kind of packing things up so they have what they need at each home, coordinate details with other parent, keep consistent drop-off routines, and sometimes special routines can help them readjust in terms of when they leave as well as when they come, things that are friendly and warm. And if they're refusing a transition to another parent, it's importantly to address that calmly with them, address it with the co-parent, and ideally, I think in that case, oftentimes it's best to seek professional help. Introducing new partners. Um, so most within 5 years, I think 3/4 of couples that divorce with families, there will be a step parent in the mix. Um, take into consideration the needs of the kids, the needs of the co-parent as well as yourself. There is often an inflaming of the co-parent, even in relatively amicable divorces when there is a new partner. Um, there are challenges as new partners enter the picture and new members enter the family. There's definitely increasing complexity. Step families, often there's different people with competing needs. There's different coalitions. Step families can work. They can work very well. There's increased resources. There's increased love potentially. There's also increased potential. There's increased complexity. And it's very important to be especially intentional about the development of the step family and to take into account the needs of the co-parent as you do that. There are alternatives such as living apart together, as we mentioned, to actually marrying or living together. So some of the takeaways, it's important to support children's emotional well-being, attend to the co-parenting relationship. We spend a lot of time on that, managing the third parties, I meant to say parties, third parties and the legal process. They can really upend the whole process of separation, divorce, and do a number on the family. Attend to your own needs. Watch for getting stuck in grief, depression, anger, or elation. Nurture sibling relationships. Remember the protective power of limits. Encourage open communication with children without forcing discussion, and that you can also get family counseling and get support groups. There are support groups, and here's some resources. So let's see. I'm going to stop the share. Okay.
Thank you so much, Jonah. I want to ask everybody if they have any questions that they'd like to put in the chat specifically for Jonah. And none of the questions in the chat or what goes on in the chat is recorded. It's simply the discussion and what Jonah and I present. So no need to worry about those becoming public in any way in our recordings. I do have a few questions that were submitted previously. So I
Okay.
can jump in with some of those. So in terms of specific strategies for helping children who struggle with change in general or who have learning or emotional differences, do you have any suggestions on approaching those children or how to talk to those children?
Broadly speaking, they're going to need more consistency, more coordination and collaboration with co-parents. The approximation rule is even more vital. And of course, speaking to them in a developmentally appropriate way about the separation and divorce.
And what if you have eight kids that are multiple ages? So elementary school, middle school, and even lower high school, all in the same family. Do you talk to them all at once? Do you break them down and talk to them in individuals? How do the parents approach that when they've decided that they're going to split up?
I mean, some of this depends on the not just the ages, but the developmental ages of the kids. Broadly speaking, I think it's important that there at least be a time and a place for talking with the whole family together, ideally with the co-parent, but also in the individual households to be able to talk with the family together, as well as separately and in groups. But yes, I do think that that's important. And to stress that the sibling, how important the sibling relationship is in the well-being of the whole family.
Okay. Another question that we have is related to involving a therapist from the get-go. So is it best for the couple who's deciding to split up to seek their own therapy, and or to seek a therapist for their kids? Should they talk about it like all together? Like, what's the best way to approach the situation when you are actually proactively not attempting not to hurt your children?
Yeah, so if you can go to a ideally ideally if there's somebody that has some alliance with both parents and ideally has the potential to have an alliance with children. I'm biased because I do work from a family systems perspective, although I do work individually as well. Um, but I think also it's important that there be somebody that ideally that the family can trust if you're looking for help on the outside, that everybody has some alliance to some way. Which doesn't mean people can't, the teenager can't have their own therapist, for instance, when there's kids of different ages in the home, for instance.
Okay. And what do you recommend when the parents are splitting up and one parent is moving far away, let's say a flight away? How do you approach that with the kids about the coming changes?
Yeah, the important thing is the relationship as much as possible. Now, it's important not to set up unreasonable expectations, but as I said kind of before, custody is more for us. And even when you don't see a parent, having a knowledge that the parent has you in their mind is really maybe most important for the child as they're developing. If they know that their dad or mom thinks about them and is thoughtful and speaks with the person that the parent that they're residing with, it's really essential. Um, and then, of course, but yeah, it certainly sets up a distance, literally, and it sets up barriers to the relationship that's important to work through. Sometimes that this is the way families organize themselves. Um,
Yeah, the one thing I just wanted to add to that answer is just because I lived through it. My parents got divorced when I was two. And when I was 8 or 9, my dad moved to Pennsylvania. And so it did become a flight back and forth. And knowing exactly when I was going up and coming back was really helpful to me. Like I knew that it was the third week of every month and it was 2 weeks in
um,
the summer. And having that to look forward to know I was seeing my dad was really helpful. My parents had a very acrimonious divorce. They were in court until I was
oh,
in eighth grade. So if that gives you any idea of the
oh,
background.
sorry
So
to
I've
hear
kind of
that.
lived,
Thank you for
yeah,
sharing
yeah,
that.
it is. It is. And as I shared with Jonah earlier, my husband went through a pretty nasty divorce himself that falls under that high conflict divorce. So I think that one of the things I do want to say is if you guys can stay on the same page and focus on the kids instead of hating each other, that can really be a huge help too, because the common goal of having the kids be come out of it with as little trauma as possible, I think is the best way to go. So I do think seeking someone like Jonah out to meet with before you even talk to the kids to ask how to do it and when to do it and all those things is can be tremendously helpful to kids um, as you go through this. Not that I'm the expert Jonah is, but I've lived it now I think through
Yeah,
my life twice. So
yeah,
just my
very good.
single suggestion. Any other questions out there?
Or comments if people feel comfortable sharing.
Yeah, and feel
Wendy,
free to
thank
put
you.
a hypothetical in there.
Yeah,
Um,
oh, that's a good idea.
we can absolutely feel free to use a hypothetical. We don't know who you are anyways. Um,
Hi, I wanted to ask about once post-divorce and there's a lot of conflict still. recommendations that you have on how to deal with that.
So, if there's a lot of conflict, I would, generally speaking, I don't think that experts need to be in the picture all the time. I don't think families need to go to therapy when there's it necessarily, or kids need to go to therapy necessarily if there's divorce. If there's conflict post-divorce, to the extent that you can persuade your co-parent to go to some form of co-parenting consultation, whatever that is. It can be enormously helpful. And when there's setting up, to the extent that there's conflict, having more formalized kinds of communication. As I said, there's cooperative co-parenting, where it's kind of very friendly, and then there's parallel parenting, where it's kind of it might be by email, it might be that you're speaking only about certain topics, and even getting into the tone of the email and the types of words that you use. Be very intentional about it. Does that help? Or do you have another question?
What happens if one of the parents is no longer interested in being in the children's life? How do you handle that? What's a good approach for that?
I mean, you want to help. I mean, part of it is, I mean, oftentimes it's not quite, if I could, Wendy, um, it, it could, I mean, I would start with the premise that the person doesn't feel that they have a role, um, or they might not be encouraged enough to feel that they have a role, and to be convinced of the importance of the role. Generally speaking, when I'm working with parents who are not as involved and kind of abdicating their both kind of limit setting and nurturing responsibilities, they may feel rejected by the kid. They may feel rejected by the other parent. They may feel incompetent. And it's oftentimes the parent that the kid that is allied with that it's important to work with that parent as a therapist anyway. And I would say if you're that parent, to realize your role. It doesn't mean you're responsible for the fact that they're abdicating their role or they don't, but that you could have a role in encouraging them back in.
Definitely always hard for kids when one parent isn't interested, who's been around in sticking around. So that's very interesting. Obviously, feel free to reach out to Jonah if you have more specific questions, and you can give him, rather than a hypothetical, more specifics about your family. And we, if you have any other questions or any other feedback that you want, definitely feel free to reach out, or you can unmute real quick and ask the question. We don't mind that at all. And then while you're doing that, I am just going to show our information in case anybody needs that. And I will then pause for a minute to see if anybody does want to unmute and ask a question. Any takers? Okay, well, we want to first and foremost thank Jonah for being here today and appreciate all of his insights and feedback. Divorce is very complicated, as I noted. I know way too much about divorce law as being a recovering attorney, as well as having gone through it. And so, my best piece of advice from all the seats that I've sat in is just put your kids first, and remember that you being angry or your spouse being angry, the focus is on the kids. They didn't choose this. And it's okay to get divorced, but consider them and get them the support they need, and make sure to always keep their best interest in the front of your item.
Thank you, Wendy. That's a great summary. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you sharing so much of yourself. And that was very, I thought, courageous of you.
Well, people say I should just not stand-up comedy at this point, because it's comical, all the stuff that happens. But I'm also very empathetic to people and empathetic to children that go through it, and really believe that if people could just focus on their kids, they wouldn't have as much energy to hate each other.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, thank you so much for your expertise and your guidance with today, Jonah. Your insights have been incredibly valuable in helping all of these folks, and hopefully other families, approach divorce with real intention, compassion, and a focus on their children's emotional well-being. I do want to encourage everyone to reach out to Jonah. Again, it's hard for him to speak on hypotheticals, but I'm sure that he can provide some insights and potentially, even act as a coach. If you're interested in talking with him or seeing him, he can probably guide you to the right people, even if it's not him based on his location. But definitely feel free to reach out. It's hard to find resources like this that are empathetic to both sides and don't jump in on one side against the other.
And you
Thank
can
you to
use my
all of.
personal email, which I gave out somewhere.
Oh, sure. You can type it in the chat too. Go ahead and type it in the chat. And
Okay.
thanks to everyone who joined. Divorce is never easy, but having the right tools and approach and knowing that there's other people out there that can support you and your kids really will help you get through these hard times, and it will promote security and stability and resilience for your children. If you'd like to connect with Jonah, here's his URL as well. It's Jonah Green and Associates, all one word, no spaces.com. So you can find out about his practice there. And at Illuminos, if you need help with your children while you're going through this, we do work with both acrimonious divorces and divorces that people get along. So we want to, again, support the kids through it. So thank you so much for joining, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you at our next Less Stress Parenting webinar. Jonah, thank you so much. Everybody for attending, thank you so much. Excuse me. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
And thank you for being such a gracious host.
Oh, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. Take care.
Okay, have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.